Okay, thanks so much for coming, everyone, to CryptoParty London. I hope you enjoyed some workshops. If I haven't mentioned already, we do these events every month. So if this wasn't enough crypto for you, then come next month. We're at the Free Word Centre. You can follow us on Twitter at CryptoPartyLDN, where we post updates about our events. This is, I think, one of the most exciting panels that we've ever had at Crypto Party. I'm so excited about it. And a really interesting topic for discussion, how digital culture and journalism are influencing each other. The speakers that we have really are experts and such an interesting collection of people to speak about this topic. We have Gabriella Coleman, who holds the Wolf Chair in Scientific and Technological Literacy at McGill University. Trained as an anthropologist, her scholarship explores the intersection of the cultures of hacking in politics with a focus on the social political implications of the free software movement and Anonymous. She's authored 2 books that some of you will have read, Coding Freedom, The Ethics and Aesthetics of Hacking, and Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy, The Many Faces of Anonymous. We also have Joseph Cox, who's a journalist covering cybersecurity, the digital underground, and the surveillance industry for Motherboard. We have Tatiana Bazzichelli, who's the artistic director of the Disruption Network Lab. She's also a visiting lecturer at the Faculty School of Potsdam, at the Department of Applied Culture. She was previously a postdoc researcher at the Centre for Digital Cultures and has a PhD in Information and Media Studies, and has also authored books, the network, which include Networked Disruption and Networking, and she co-edited Disrupting Business in 2013. And then we have Lauri Love, who's a computer scientist with a long history of involvement in political activism. He played a prominent role in the student and Occupy movements in Glasgow from 2011 to 2012. And as many of you know, he faced potential extradition to the United States for his alleged involvement in Op Last Resort, which was a series of online protests following the persecution and untimely death of Aaron Swartz. He's increasingly being recognised as an expert on hacking, surveillance and privacy issues in the UK, and an all-round good person. And has made a principled stand against the country's forced decryption laws. So I think I'm going to just exit from this expert panel, and we'll have introductory comments and views, starting with Gabriella Coleman, if that's okay, and then followed by Joseph. Mm-hmm. And then, I feel like I'm lining up like a fight or something.
Like a school exam.
Yeah. And then maybe you could go next, Tatiana. And then go next. Thank you. And then we'll have Q&A and open up for what will surely be an interesting discussion.
Thanks. Great. Well, thanks for that introduction. It's really great to be here. And for my introductory comments, I'm just going to reflect back on a panel that I was at earlier, where one of the speakers was basically arguing that for politics today, we need organizing, not technology. That technology is, in many ways, the problem, in part because technology today and for a long time around computing enables surveillance and control. And, we would be extremely naive not to recognize just the levels of control and surveillance that are enabled by computing. And it's really, I think, counterproductive to also boost up technology and claim that it's going to be some sort of savior for the second coming of democracy. That is incredibly counterproductive. At the same time, technology today is a little bit like fish in water. Fish cannot survive out of water. Technology is our reality. And in many ways, even if it's, I think, vital not to over boost the role of technology, it's suicide also not to take control of the means of technology and what it can offer, both for journalism and social movements as well. And in fact, I think it's incredibly important to think about how one can both exploit everything that technology can have to offer. And I think one of the reasons why the far right today is powerful is both because of their content, but the ways in which they've built alternative media empires, the ways in which they've controlled the means of production, and so on and so forth. So that, I think, alone kind of points to why technology is so important. It's also really, really important to sometimes remake technology as well and support those technologists who are providing new tools to fight surveillance, such as Tor, Signal, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to kind of open making that statement and to finish, because I really do want to keep it brief so that we have time to discuss. I also want to highlight 3 examples of the power of technology in journalism. One is historical. Who here has heard of Indie Media? So some people. So Indie Media was a huge alternative independent network of technologists who in many ways invented social media as we know it today. They built platforms that were rooted in local places but allowed people to upload images and videos at a time it was really impossible to do so. And Indie Media is a great example too, because it was very much rooted in face-to-face organizing, but it also shows the power of technology to connect groups across the world. And Indie Media kind of doesn't exist anymore in part because it was a victim of its own success, and there's other reasons why the network dismantled. But it's a really good example of the ways in which technology interface with social movements on the ground in powerful ways. Another kind of, I think, really exciting element of technology and hacking concerns the ability of hackers today to break into corporations and steal documents and emails.
Copy.
Say that again?
Copy documents and emails.
Copy. That's right, copy. We have to get our terminology correct here. And hand it over to journalists. And it is an extremely risky endeavor, and I'm not encouraging anyone to do it. I'm just commenting on the fact that it is done. And it provides a level of protection for the person doing it if they're really quite careful, in a way that when activists in the past used to break into places to take documents was so risky that it barely happened historically. So it's a really different and exciting opportunity that exists today. And then finally, I'm just going to mention Twitter. Twitter is many things. It's a hellhole of propaganda and bots, and can be manipulated in really powerful ways. But one of the parts that I find really exciting about Twitter is when a journalist, for example, publishes an incorrect story, there's groups of people who push back. And it's an important corrective that didn't necessarily exist 20, 25 years ago. And again, this is not to kind of endow Twitter with this amazing power to herald the second coming of democracy, but just to go back to my original point, technology is like fish in water. It's something that's part of our reality, and we can either exploit it, remake it, and use it to our advantage, or let our competitors do so to our peril. That's it for me.
Hi, so I'll keep it brief as well, but as mentioned, I'm Joseph Cox. Motherboard is the technology and science section of Vice, so we'll cover everything from quantum mechanics up to the data breach of a porn website, and that's thankfully, luckily, where I spend most of my time, not on porn websites, on the data breaches affecting these sites. So that would be anything from a company that hacks phones for law enforcement. Somebody stole 900 gigabytes of data, which is an almost unfathomable amount of information that, as Gabriella says, activists, maybe even 10 years ago, would not necessarily be able to get that stuff, let alone decades ago, right? So it would be that, or it may be emails from a surveillance company, as we saw with Hacking Team, and of course that was done publicly, and I think we'll talk more about public dumps as well. And then, not every day necessarily, but probably every week we get a data breach, which will be something a little more insipid or a little bit more mundane, which, as I mentioned, will be passwords and email addresses for a porn website, or maybe a police forum, or some sort of video sharing site, or whatever it may be. Something where there are consumers, basically. But the reason this is kind of interesting, and just building on the previous points, is that we can get this data quickly, relatively easily, and the source doesn't really need to jeopardize themselves. If you send something in the mail, maybe it'll get scanned or whatever it might be, even though that's still a relatively safe way. I'll sit on my computer a lot, wait for a hacker to contact me. I promise I do actually do other work around that rather than just waiting for someone to send me stuff. Eventually they'll do it, and I have most of the time, probably 95% of the time, I have no idea who sent me the data. And it doesn't matter, because I can go and independently verify this data and see the website it came from, or the company it came from, or whatever it may be. So we are kind of in this, it's a horrible cliche, but a golden age of receiving these data breaches, which are sometimes in the public interest, sometimes not. You have to be able to decide what you should publish, what you don't. I mean, we've passed on data breaches a hell of a lot of the time. There was one where, I don't know, a mountain bike shop was hacked, and I don't care. Like, I don't think our readers are going to care about that. Has, I don't know, 100,000 customers? Yeah, I don't know. The biking press can write about that. You have ones which are still in the public interest, but very difficult to handle. And the reason I bring this up is because if we're talking about digital culture, maybe with 4chan, or maybe the more horrible bits of Twitter, there'll be people who will talk about certain subjects, and as a journalist you have to decide whether you're going to amplify those or not. One data breach I covered maybe last year was for users of a website where people would gather to share their love of anal fisting, which is a very particular niche passion. So when I contacted 100 people, 100 apparent users of that, none of them got back to me, kind of unsurprisingly, but we still managed to verify the data. So even though there's a lot of this public interest stuff coming out, as I mentioned, with the hacking team and Celebrate, there's also a hell of a lot of crap because hackers are going around and popping everything they can. And then I'll just briefly end on what Gabriella said about Twitter, and you have people pushing back. Probably the best example of that at the moment is a story in Bloomberg, which the TLDR is that Bloomberg claims that China, or the Chinese government, put small malicious chips into the motherboards of a company, which then ended up on the servers of Apple and Amazon. Apple says that's wrong, Amazon says it's wrong, the Department of Homeland Security says they have no reason to believe that, the NCSC, which is the defensive part of GCHQ, says they have no reason to believe that. Today, as you mentioned earlier, like an hour, maybe a couple of hours ago, Tim Cook came out from Apple, the CEO, and said this is wrong, they should retract it. That didn't come out of nowhere. Over the past couple of weeks, the information security community on Twitter has been really aggressively pushing back against this story. So there is that sort of culpability and calling people out on their journalism, which, as I say, we wouldn't have had a decade ago, or maybe a little bit longer. But I'll leave it at that, and yeah, thank you.
So thank you everybody. I'm Tatiana Bazzichelli from the Disruption Network Club in Berlin. Sorry, I'm a bit sick, so my voice is not really flourishing as usual, but I think they are more compromised than you because they're close to me to get my virus. So, but usually, sometimes viruses are nice things. So I just wanted to start by making a reflection on the discourse of digital culture, because when I was discussing with Fabio, when he invited me to speak here, he initially told me we could speak about how digital culture influenced journalism, and I say, no, this is really important, but I think from my point of view it's also important to do the other way around, like how journalism influenced digital culture. Because I think in our perspective it's always important to go beyond borders and trying also to bring together different expertise. And so I've been working with digital culture now since the 90s, and I want to speak a bit in a way how I see a transformation, also thanks to the development of technology and also thanks to hacking and now whistleblowing. because when we were all really passionate in the 90s about digital culture, we were really discussing on the discourse of how to produce projects and, for example, artistic projects that were working on the net. So the idea of really working on the internet was the most important thing, to try to stretch the limit of the medium, to try to understand what was beyond, to try also to opening up. So that is why also the discourse of digital culture was strictly connected with the one of hacking. So there was a lot of reflection really on the medium itself, on the technology, on the net. And I think that in the last, I would say, 10 years, but also less, I mean, I would say since, maybe we could even say with the first act of whistleblowings done by people that are, not the sources like in the Pentagon and so on, but really young generation of whistleblowers, we see that digital culture also totally changed, because if we want to discuss on what is digital culture, we have to go also beyond the digital, because if we speak about technology, we have also to speak about, for sure, the influence of technology on society, on politics, on a much bigger picture than before. So I think that digital culture today is perhaps better defined as post-digital culture, because it's not just the digital per se, but becomes the society. And I think here are the connection with journalism, because, for example, I also want to position myself on the specific practice we do. In Berlin, we run this conference program that is called Disruption Network Lab, and of course is rooted on digital culture, but at the same time also we try to bring together different expertise like whistleblowers, hackers, activists, journalists, researchers, artists, and I think this is really the change that we can make to try to go beyond just the limit of technology, to speak about society and politics in a bigger picture, and also try to connect with other figures that are really important. So I would say that the hacker today could also be considered as an artist, or as a whistleblower is, even from my point of view, an artist, because he's somebody that is totally disrupting a system from the inside, is creating a change of mind, a change of perception that then goes to inform the society at large. So it's an act of whistleblowing that becomes also an act of politics, of culture, and of change in general. So I think that, maybe I'm happy really to speak here, because I think here people are trying to opening up technology to understand it in a conscious way. And I think my invitation would be, what is the next level? So how do we bring technology in a conscious way as a way to change society and to inform society as, if you want, an act of disruption of even art? And so the advocacy here is try also to bring expertise together to go over the limits of the different sectors, and in a sense also try to provoke change in that direction.
So hi, I'm Lauri, and probably be brief because I certainly didn't think about it much in advance, but just to flesh out the bio, we just won a extradition case. We've been fighting for about 4 years to the USA, where they very much wanted to take me over there. I've never been before, but to answer to allegations of computer hacking associated with hacktivist campaign under the anonymous branding, shall we say, in response to the death of Aaron Swartz, and which would have resulted potentially in me being locked up for 99 years, again in a country I've never visited, due to an extraterritorial extension of jurisdiction, and as a consequence of some less than optimal extradition arrangements we have with the USA. The other thing that's relevant and was mentioned is in the process of that, or having had property seized by the National Crime Agency in the UK, which was then not returned despite an investigation under UK law not resulting in criminal charges here in the UK, that property was never returned, and the reason for it not being returned was the use of, or the claimed use of, strong encryption. And we've been here at CryptoParty learning, how to use technology so that we can operate as journalists or as private citizens or as anybody that understands the importance of privacy and autonomy. And the indirect consequence of some things on my computers not being comprehensible to the state is that without due process, without a hearing, I've been dispossessed of those computers and that data, which at that point in my life represented the whole sum of all information that I had. So, digital memories, portfolios, but potentially work of journalistic or public interest importance, which I won't get back. There's still a case pending, so I did manage to win a victory through the case management of me suing the National Crime Agency to have my property back, where it was suggested that a direction be set. Court directions are kind of when the evidence is produced, and it's generally dull timetabling things, but a suggestion was made that a direction be set that the case can't proceed. I can't have a hearing to decide whether I have a right to property unless those passwords were disclosed. And they did get away with this once in a lay magistrate's setting in Bury St Edmunds, and we withdrew the case and had it eventually moved to Westminster, and a lot of press turned up, and there was a lot of attention, and Dowsey Street Pro Bono got involved, and the victory, the result was that there can be no requirement that data is comprehensible before you have a right to have a hearing about that property. And so a precedent has been set, but it's still not finished. I kind of need to bring that case to conclusion to determine that it boils down to this question: you have a right to property, and you've always had a right to property, including writing, including documents. Now, because it's digital, do you still have a right to property, or is that right contingent on the state being able to read all of it against your will through your forced facilitation, forced decryption? And that remains to be see where it goes. As for my thoughts on the topic of discussion, my involvement in journalism has been as an object of journalism because of the extradition case. So I'm not a journalist. I read a lot of it and I have thoughts about it. I think, as I've already alluded to, people in digital culture, and hackers especially, share operational security requirements with journalists that journalists now need to understand, and so there can be an informing in that direction. And the other point is, I had a nice conversation yesterday with someone in connection with the case around the Panama Papers, and there was really good reporting, which still needs to be carried forward, but it's informed by a massive leak, which came facilitated, and in other recent cases by hackers. And I think maybe it's worth thinking about in terms of source protection, in that sources can be within an organisation and can incur massive risks by becoming whistleblowers, and it often can result in their identification and the legal consequences or the career consequences. If people can become open to sources, journalistic sources from outside of an organisation, if it can then inform public interest journalism, then as much needs to be done to do that as possible. And there's technologies like SecureDrop, and Joseph will be able to say more about how we can make that easier and make more use of it. It's about it.
Are there any questions?
The first one I have, sorry, I've been out of the country for a few years. What has happened to the Panama Papers? Because as far as I'm aware, that it was the thin edge, the thin end of the wedge.
Mm-hmm.
What has happened to it?
That's a good question. I mean, there was a distributed consortium of journalists that kind of did the initial field work and legwork of sifting through all of this data and getting some stories out of it. And then I think the common tragedy of attention span and the news cycle kind of happened to it, and it still requires people to push it forward. And I would say, I mean, it's worth noting that it was scary enough to some powerful people that someone was killed, someone was murdered for it in Malta, and it's exposed a lot of corruption in that state, and it has shed light on other people. You know, there were a few stories in the UK. David Cameron had to say a few things. There were things to do with the Prince of Wales's estate,
But they're still walking around.
but they're still walking around. Yeah, and as for the company itself, it's Mossack Fonseca. I think they may even still be in business, or if they go out of business, their contacts that they had will just move to another, organisation that does the same thing. So
nothing.
Yeah. We still have work to do, and it opened a crack and it gave material, but there needs to be people that carry that forward, and that's journalism's role, but also other sectors of civil society to agitate and tax reform. The problem is there's so much vested power in a lot of Brexit is to do with potentially us becoming not just the overseas territories being tax havens, but UK becoming that in some sense. And there's a lot of vested power in this, and that will push back, and if people don't maintain the interest to use that information, then having access to the information is itself not enough. And I can say from anonymous things, hacktivist things, where large data dumps have happened, for the short time that you have people looking at that, you get results out of it, and you get things exposed, and people push the story forward. But there's still massive troves of data that are now lost to, forgotten about.
But tomorrow there will be Frederick Obermeier speaking, so maybe you can also ask him directly.
Politicians resigned because of, and they lost their jobs because of the Panama Papers. It was actually one of the most impactful pieces of journalism ever. The data isn't lost. You can go to icij.com and you can look through very large caches of the data itself if you want. So, and with these large data dumps, not really in style of WikiLeaks, because of course they don't just indiscriminately dump this stuff. This is still being useful. Just today or the day before, the Washington Post dug up an old email from the hacking team dump that showed one of the murder suspects, or part of the Saudi hit squad, was included in those emails. So maybe years from now we'll see more stuff come out from the ICIJ's work on the Panama Papers, but it may not be instantaneous.
So, I'd say there's a long tail to the utility of these dumps, but people have to keep mining in it. But it's open and there, and that's why it's worth reminding people that you can go in and you can cross-correlate that with other things, and it might be the missing piece of a jigsaw somewhere down the line.
You mentioned about attention span.
Yeah.
So, attention span of the public moves on.
I would just add that the ICIJ said like 400 publicly traded companies have lost 135 billion in revenue due to this. So
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Question.
Hi everybody. I want you to try to take a step back, and I'm thinking about the internet world as a place of conflict, in the sense that conflict is inherent characteristic of society. And I want you, if you can tell us something about your specific expertise about surveillance, but we generally consider surveillance as an activity like top-down, like the state against the society. I'd like you to tell something about, let's call it horizontal surveillance, so the clash of different groups, political activists, among them. So taking the state, let's say, outside of the equation for a moment. So in your opinion, according to your experience, are citizens, hackers, journalists engaging in surveillance activities that in the past belonged to police or security agencies or not? And the second question is the state trying to co-opt them and taking them as part of the surveillance system nowadays? Especially I'm thinking about polarized society and societies in which the clash between different groups is very...
What society, sorry?
Polarized.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe I can say something. Just to give a concrete example, the last conference we organized of the Disruption Lab in Berlin was in September, was called Infiltration. And infiltration has been really a practice that was typical of the police. We know that, back in the 60s, a lot of governmental agency or police members were also infiltrating a lot of movements. And also, we know the practice of infiltration is pretty much top-down things, but instead, this is the research we did recently. We figured out that there are really young people that nowadays are applying the practice of infiltration inside the alt-right. And so they go inside alt-right groups to understand how they work, to map their networks, to understand their strategies. And so basically they fake their own, affiliation by claiming that they're part of this group, but they are not. So I suggest you to check, for example, the activity of Patrick Hermerson. He has been doing this in actually a year in the UK through Hope Not Hate. And they have been infiltrating the UK alt-right and also the US alt-right for 1 year undercover. So I think this is pretty interesting. Also, Julia Ebner did the same year with Generation Identity. And I think it's something we have to reflect about, because we were also discussing what infiltration means today. Is a practice that is really nasty, if you want, because you are working on the trust of the people, they trust you, and instead, of course, you are going there for another objective, but sometimes can be also effective, especially if we speak about the emergence of the right-wing extremism.
I mean, I can speak to that a little bit too. What I find really interesting about digital culture and the question that you just asked has to do with propaganda more than surveillance. But historically, with a few exceptions, it was states who had the power to produce propaganda and also mine information to produce propaganda. And so, something that not everyone knows about is during World War I, governments, West and East and the Russians tended to intercept all the mail coming out of the war zones to gauge the mood of the population in order then to spin propaganda to the population based on the correspondence between soldiers and the population, right? And so for you to do that, you needed armies of people and access to the mail. What I find really interesting today is that far-right groups and alt-right groups are explicitly trying to create mass waves of propaganda. So there's grassroots propaganda in a way that tended to exist as a kind of top-down phenomena. And that, to me, strikes as something pretty historically new, is that people on the ground can really coordinate with each other. And then also powerful actors in the far right are very aware of that bottom-up propaganda and are also spinning their news, let's just say in Breitbart and stuff like that, to kind of cultivate that bottom-up propaganda.
I just want to say, in addition, on the so a lot of this kind of battlefield, or the battlefield exists now, but a lot of the utilisation of it is revolving around this fight between the extreme right, the alt-right, and anti-fascist elements. And so another group, Unicorn Riot, in the US, have been infiltrating, or not even infiltrating, but participating under false personas into these, what's the name of the platform? Discord, yeah, Discord things, where it's this diaspora of these organisational groups for the far right kind of street brawling, but also the alt-right kind of LARPing or ironic, racist, and so people are getting involved with that. But there's this generalised concept of surveillance, up in the other direction, and there's so much. I wanted to use the example of 1974. I think some anti-war activists broke into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, I think, and they found documents that eventually revealed a lot of the COINTELPRO stuff that then informed a lot of the congressional inquiries, and we now look back on that era as one of the watersheds of transparency into states and actions against subversive elements. And there is now, that required people to go in physically to an office and take a physical risk, and it's difficult and hard to scale. On the internet there are a million caches of information like that, and some of it is on the surface level, on the open, transparent web, and then below that there are people that can just dig a little bit deeper, and even that scales very widely. And regardless of what your beliefs are on WikiLeaks in practice now, one of the core tenets of the effect of having something like WikiLeaks, of having a place where people can anonymously dump information that gives transparency into government organisations or corporate activities, is that it's not exactly what people specifically find out, but it's the risk that anything, and you don't know, you can't rule out what gets uncovered, is that changes the analysis of doing secretive things or doing malicious things or being engaged in activities that would fall apart if they come to light. And we know that after the Snowden leaks, for instance, that there would have to be a change in what decisions are made by surveillance organisations, by security agencies, as to what programmes they will engage in, because they can no longer rule out that at some point it becomes public. And so that opening up from state or powerful interest, the ability to surveil to everyone through the network power of the internet, really changes the analysis of a lot of groups, and it's good to work with that.
Just really briefly, on the question about there being these powers that would usually maybe be by the state and then perhaps spread out to others, in this idea of horizontal surveillance. We've been covering the issue of so-called spouseware or stalkerware. This is malware which you physically install on Android or iPhone. It can get your emails, your Facebook messages, your GPS location. It can live tap a phone. It can remotely turn on a microphone. It can remotely turn on the camera. You can get your photos. Basically, anything a state-level hacker could do, you'd be able to do with this, but you have to install it physically. It can't be done remotely.
And it's troubling who it's marketed towards.
And it's done exactly for primarily men to monitor their wives, so then it can facilitate domestic abuse, sexual abuse, and ultimately rape and stalking in some cases. So that is something that, as I said, would usually be reserved for state or local law enforcement or whatever it may be, or federal law enforcement, and that's being spread out. As for the question of whether governments are kind of going back against that, I only know of one case where the DOJ in the US has charged someone for doing this. Well, they first of all charged the owner of a website, of a company called Stealth Genie. As for an actual user, the only time that person got indicted was because they happened to put the malware on a police officer's phone. And the skeptic in me thinks that they're not really going to give a shit if it wasn't on a law enforcement officer's phone, basically. So there's still that imbalance there. Yeah.
And it's worth noting, it's hard to imagine a way that story would have been told and that concerning market would have been exposed without the relationship between hackers and journalists.
Right, sorry, very, very briefly, I forgot to say that we've got about 7 or 8 data dumps from individual companies now. Now include customer records, sometimes the GPS locations of the victims themselves who are actually being surveilled, and it managed to give us a sort of idea of the scale of the issue, as in hundreds of thousands of people are buying this across the world, not just in the UK or the US, but Europe, Asia, Africa, South America as well. And that would not have been possible, as you say, without the help, essentially, of hackers. Yeah.
And I think there's like a filter down effect. This software is created and it's of value, and first it's sold to the FBI or to nation state intelligence agencies, and then it will drip down into other markets, and it's like creepy stuff like this, or corporate surveillance of employees, or things like that. So it's only going to get more ubiquitous. So there's positive and negative sides to the proliferation of surveillance capabilities, and it's a difficult one.
Just you mentioned the Bloomberg thing earlier, where there's the story that China had apparently put like chips in all of these servers used by Amazon and Apple. And I work in the security industry myself, actually, and there's a lot of like corporate interest in sort of putting out these what are essentially PR releases, and they may not really be checked or by the companies putting them out. To be honest, they might not be verified. They may just be someone wants a lot of attention. Is there how do you kind of advise, like how do you deal with this kind of thing? So I imagine you must get approached by the people all the time. Is there a way for sort of journalism to deal with this as a whole, I guess, versus?
So the Bloomberg one is interesting because Bloomberg says they have 17 anonymous sources, which if you've ever read a piece of journalism, that's an insane amount of sources. I mean, most stories you can have 2 or 4 at max, right?
An
But
insane number of anonymous sources
Right.
on top of it.
right. And then, but they have that, and then you brought up press releases, and Apple has vehemently come out and flat out denied it, as did Amazon. That is super unusual. Usually you will have Apple go, we disagree with the gist of the article or something like that, or they'll point to specific points. Here they're saying the whole fucking thing is wrong. And that doesn't happen unless it is absolutely wrong. And someone will counter and say, well, Apple has a vested interest in obviously protecting their stock price. If it ever came out they lied, that would be catastrophic to them. And they wouldn't lie like that.
My understanding too is that the journalists had published a previous story that was dubious as well.
Yeah, they said that a hack in an oil explosion in Turkey or gas explosion in Turkey was apparently a cyber attack, and everyone else, including the NSA, disagreed with that. Yeah.
Within journalism, sorry, I'm now asking a question to another panelist, but within journalism, is there like a pushback against this, and like we don't want to break this, whatever this like barrier between just printing something because it's plausible, you know, and actually doing the due diligence?
Yeah. There's been a massive pushback against the Bloomberg one because we already have to fight enough today, because a lot of people, especially on Twitter. .com are really sceptical of journalists, as they should be, but this is now really chipped away at the trust that people are going to have in the InfoSec press, especially. We don't really know what the fallout's going to be, but the next time an anonymously sourced piece comes out, I mean, we'll have one soon. We use anonymous sources a lot, and people will be like, well, why should I fucking believe you? So we're going to have to deal with that eventually as well, yeah. Which again brings back to the whole digital culture point of this pushback from Twitter and that sort of thing, or just online communities in general, right? Yeah.
Actually, I also have a question. Can I?
Yeah.
Actually, 2 questions. One is related to the discourse of the anonymity of the source, because today in a panel they were actually mentioning the fact that Snowden decided not to be anonymous, and he decided this also because one of the reasons was that he didn't want to make accountable people that was not him, because he knew that if a source is anonymous, then sometimes they get the wrong person, or maybe the journalists get enormous pressure, so he decided to totally be public. And but then, we also see the consequence of that, because all the people that, in a sense, have been public, they became public, they have been, suffering really incredible pressure and charges, and I think this is totally also in proportion because they still apply the Espionage Act. That is what also today was discussed. And I think this is an open question in a sense, because with the fact that now we are also facing this big quantity of data, we have also different kind of exposure, different kind of whistleblowing that is really different from the past. So people can access a lot of data, and then the question is what to do with that. So the first question would be, is better to be anonymous or not? And the second question would be, once I have all this data, what do I do with them? So shall I decide to give to specific journalists like Snowden did, or like with the Panama paper, then they also decide to spread it among different journalists and consortiums, because there was a quantity that I think is one of the reasons why also often these investigations stop, because actually the journalists cannot really process this data, and this is the case of Laura Poitras and Greenwood.
So, can I answer a little bit? I'll start a little bit on the second one with the example of XNet. Who here has heard of XNet? Okay, so they're a kind of whistleblowing hacktivist organization in Spain. And they're very interesting in part because I think they learned a lot both from Anonymous and WikiLeaks and improved on the model almost to perfection. I mean, maybe not to perfection, but first of all, they really admired anonymous leaking insofar as it protects the whistleblower. there are advantages of speaking as your person, but I'm not going to go into that. XNet themselves were also anonymous initially, in part because they didn't want the attention placed on them, but the leak. But then actually, after certain people started to claim that they were XNet and they weren't, they actually finally had to be public because they're like, actually, no, this is us who are doing the work. So they received a lot of emails from banks in Spain. They don't know if it came from an insider or a hacker who took them. And what's interesting about them is that on the one hand, they were very afraid of being accused of editorializing if they didn't publish the full email trove, but they also didn't want to violate the privacy of secretaries and others at the bank who had nothing to do with the corruption that was going on in the banks that had plunged the Spanish state into recession. So what they did was they did actually redact, but they gave the full corpus to something like 20 journalists to prove that what they were releasing was what they should release. Then they did something really smart, which was there were a lot of journalistic pieces that were published, but then they went ahead and sued the bankers. They're like, publishing information is important. There are effects like we saw with the Panama Papers, but we're going to go the extra step. And we're going to sue the bankers. They raised money, they sued the bankers, and they frickin' won. And in fact, the bankers are being sentenced into prison this week. XNet is the model, and they've thought about it very deliberately. And I also mention this because, we are in this golden age of data leaks and whistleblowing, but it's been very experimental. And there have been a lot of mistakes made by Anonymous, by WikiLeaks, right? But then I think there have been other organizations like XNet or Phineas Fisher who have been a little bit smarter either in protecting themselves in the case of Phineas Fisher, and XNet finding that right balance between transparency but also not violating people's privacy, and also realizing that the data is massive. It's so massive that unless they make it actionable, and they did not only sue the bankers, the person, Simona Levy, who is kind of one of the great shakers and movers, she read the emails and then she put on a play in Madrid and Barcelona, dramatizing the corruption in the plays. And she hired really famous actors in Spain. So it just comes to show that, leaking isn't enough. You need to make that information actionable, but leaking is a really important first step, and there's different methods of doing it as well.
On the sort of anonymous versus not anonymous, I guess I can, having experience not being anonymous by, thanks to the FBI and the National Crime Agency, and allegedly having been doing things anonymously beforehand, I can say it confers a different set of advantages, and that's what we saw with Edward Snowden. The analysis in his case is, I can be the voice of this, I can, do it, and the cost was exile effectively and potentially risking much worse. And with anonymity, you then lose, you fully entrust the people that you pass the information on through a Dropbox or something like that. With the, what goes on, and even with the Panama Papers, I don't know if it was negotiated with the source that it would be a consortium. I think that might have been a decision made by the initial recipients, and maybe journalists could actually work out some sort of protocol for this, because it might be that you need to, I was also going to suggest, journalism as a academic subject and as a body of practice needs to think about improving its skills for sifting through large data sets, because it used to be you had a story and there was a limited set of people you could speak to about that, and there was a relatively small remit scope of things that you had to search around that to inform it for background, and now you can just have massive amounts of data, and if you just connect the right dots within that dump with the right dots outside of that dump, there is a story of interest that can be useful for some civic purpose. And so it's what you do next, maybe having the access, being the journalist that relates it, and then potentially even having a next step of people that will act upon that. So with the Panama Papers, it would be tax justice activists, people that know that some of that money is fraudulent, has been diverted from public funds, or is tainted by arms trade and stuff like that. Those people should be next in line to get it and action it, and there should be a pipeline of how we go from large amounts of data via journalists to stuff gets done.
I'll just be really, really brief about this whole anonymous versus being named. With Edward Snowden and others, it's much better for the journalist if the person is named. It gives the story more credibility. And when we say that, of course, when you hold power to account and you may write about a government injustice, or whatever it may be, that's not the only case. Your source also has to be held to account. If they're anonymous, they could be full of shit. And if they're not providing accompanied documents, or whatever it may be, obviously that's going to be a greater concern. Snowden obviously had the accompanying documents, and he took the decision of, well, if I am anonymous, there's going to be a vacuum, right? And people could fill it with, well, this was the FSB, or whatever it may be. So I think that was part of his calculation. Of course, that didn't stop people saying that he's actually from the FSB and pushing that narrative anyway. But of course, the source can not always come forward. If they do, just from a journalist perspective, it is pretty helpful for giving the story credibility, if possible. Yeah.
But then I think it's important to understand what happened next also for this source, because I think here also journalists should reflect on their own role, because there is a lot of attention when the story comes out, and in that moment there is also the protection of the source, but then often people are left alone, and I think this is something that I would also feel to criticize, because we have example of whistleblowers that after the big news moment then have been left also on their own situation. And if you speak with whistleblowers, they tell you, then for example they cannot have a job easily, like John Kiriakou that we also invited at the Disruption Lab, where he's going to work. I mean, there are really situations in which your life is completely destroyed, and what do you do?
Yeah, and also if you look at the less large-scale examples of whistleblowing, like people at NASA that tried to stop the Challenger from blowing up, or some example from the Ontario government, you're treated like shit for exposing this stuff, right? And it's very, very rare that a kind of mid-level whistleblower is ever treated with respect, and oftentimes their careers are completely destroyed. And so I agree that it is, obviously it makes it more credible if a person is named, but I actually, again, think we live in a day and age, because of technology, they don't need to come forward. And so long as they have corroborating documents, right? As long as the stuff can be verified. I wish we had more anonymous whistleblowers, because if the risk was diminished, then more people maybe would be willing to do it, because many people are not willing to do it. Again, I'm talking about like mid-level whistleblowing, not like trying to save the Constitution of the United States. There's just bad shit that's happening in the place of your work. And you call that out and you will get fired. And if you're not fired, you're maligned. And again, we live in a day and age where we can get that stuff to journalists anonymously, and I think that's really important to encourage.
Just really, really briefly, when I say that it's better if the source is named, that is, again, only if there isn't... It's if they're making a claim, right? It's like, well, this anonymous person who says they're from the NSA says this sort of thing.
Absolutely.
But I totally agree with you that if there's data...
If there's data.
I don't give a shit who has given it, unless... In the case of like the DNC hack, where the story there is that it was the Russians and not a lone Romanian hacker, as much as Gustav 2.0 would try to mislead you otherwise. It depends on the story, basically.
Yeah. Okay. So, a few things. So I think it's worth reiterating and being more verbose and explicit about that we have to, as yourselves, maybe as journalists and as people in civil society, have more protection and support for whistleblowers, the long tail end, and not just on the brief bit where it's of interest and use to the public attention. And that has to be not just the superstar ones at the top, but as you say, the low level ones, because it's not that things don't just need correcting on a national front page newspaper level. Things, actually the most important, maybe the sum total of the most important things need correcting at lower levels, and so that requires better whistleblower protections through the law, and better corporate culture and better public support to complement that until that's in place. And the other thing is, it maybe hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen at some point that people are going to leak things under the guise of whistleblowers without good intentions, and I don't think there's been enough thought about that yet. So corporate leaks that are actually other corporations trying to sabotage. We already know that large corporations routinely pay mercenary hackers to get intellectual property or to engage in subversion. At some point, some of that is going to be trying to be laundered as whistleblowing and as leaks in the public interest. And so it's this question of the selectivity, you know. So when you talked about the groups, what's the name again in Spain? XNet, yeah. Okay, so having perfected that, having sort of dealt with this thorny issue of what you talk about and what you don't talk about, and it's been very easy to gloss over the cutting room floor in the edit room in a newspaper because there's some respect in the institution. It's hard to scale up that trust to a massive amount of data and then what you pick and choose. And when you release everything, you can say that you can wash your hands of that and say that we haven't curated, we can't do that, and do redactions that protect innocent collateral damage. And we need to have some ideas actually for what is the best practice of this, because otherwise it just happens quietly and nobody can learn from it, and then all mistakes happen. And there have been, redaction failures happen all the time. You know, even from people that know better. At The Intercept, the reality winner is in jail because of a redaction failure from The Intercept. You know, of all people.
Right.
We'll take a couple of final questions.
I'm Damien, I work for The Guardian, and so I'm wondering what can people who work for traditional media do to access what Yellow has described as a golden age of leaks.
The what nature of leaks?
Golden
age of leaks.
That was
I don't see them.
You're not getting enough of them.
Across my desk, so I'm wondering how can we make ourselves more attractive to these kinds of people who are getting hold of this data and who want to get published.
Question for Joseph more than me, but Secure Drop, if you don't already run and advertise a Secure Drop, get on it. And
do it properly though. Don't run it like you've got it at the moment, a Secure Drop.
Yeah, I was going to say they've got one, but I'm not involved.
Do it the other way, because the UK has one of the small amendments that did get through to the privacy right when the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act came through, was that they decided to treat web URLs as partly metadata and partly as content. So everything after the slash is content, which needs a flag signed by the Home Secretary. Everything before the slash is metadata, which is
they got it on its own domain. That's really stupid.
So do it like New York Times do, nyt.com/securedrop. You might get
They got like a funny something dot secure.
Guardian, really important secrets that the government would like to know.com.
Be loud. In every single one of my stories, I say, got a tip, you can contact Joseph Cox securely, signal number, Jabber, email, sometimes a link to the Secure Drop, but I don't usually do that because my colleague only has access to that, and I don't want him getting my scoops, basically. So they can just come direct to me. But it's really advertising yourself and being as loud as possible and giving them a good means of contact which will solve the first contact problem. So it's not just an email address.
What's interesting, it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a crop of journalists like you and Lorenzo that are very famous for, or like famous in the hacker community, right? Both because you write stories that get the tech rights, right? So then people really respect what they do, and then there's stories where you're publishing smart things about the leaks, right? So that kind of has created a reputation. Now, what's interesting is that they're journalists who don't work on tech or hackers, but who would still like the leak. You see what I'm saying? Which is a slightly different category of person. So I don't have like a great recommendation for that, as opposed to, well, cultivate all these great stories and sources around technology and leaks and so on and so forth. But some of these people who provide leaks really do judge the journalists very closely. Are they good about their sources? Are they reporting accurately? And this does make a difference in terms of who they go to as well.
I can say on the counter side of that, that's, in the community, inverted commas, of people that might come forward with some of these things, is that word does spread if someone is going to report on it accurately with some understanding and is definitely not going to do anything silly, because you are still entrusting. You know, even, no matter what technology you use to intermediate, there's still going to be a level of trust because there'll be correspondence. You know, potentially that. So you can garner that reputation, and it is a bit of a chicken and egg thing because if you're not already getting them, how do you do it right well to be known as someone who does it well? But you can also be willing, if you have any influence on what comes out online, to cover a story that's maybe a bit more tech orientated, that is of relevance to the hacker community, and do it in a way that they're going to read it and say, yeah, that's good, and not, you know, and there's a lot of that, and you know, I don't know, but yeah, that's possible.
There is one there.
Sorry, I missed it. There's a question at the back.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can answer a bit more, please.
Go for it. Question at the back.
Question back.
Did you have a question?
Okay. So, what if journalists gotten more like a source saying one thing, but then all of a sudden there's like a Western media or Western journalists saying that it's not right, or it's just you're just making it up. So how can a journalist prove without giving up his source that is right or not?
We don't run stories based on one source. They're going to be based on multiple independent sources and corroborating information such as documents and that sort of thing. I think I've only ever run one piece that was based on one source, and obviously I knew who the source was and I was really sure in what they were saying, but that is the exception. Yeah, we corroborate.
Are there any more comments in respect?
I just want to say it's an interesting question to what extent the documents speak for themselves, because you get enough of a document and you can just say that this couldn't have been fabricated, but there may be smaller ones where that is liminal, you know, and that's an interesting question that's yet to be resolved.
And this is a bit of a statement question, but I kind of suspect that forgeries and documents are going to become a bit more common with hacks, leaks, right?
Yeah.
But we've been in this era where basically everything that was leaked was what it was. The DNC never questioned that they were hacked and the emails were real. But one can really imagine in the future where there's really, implanted information in these massive data leaks.
As a geeky crypto thing, sometimes they're self-verifying, so the emails, like, they actually have a cryptographic DKIM thing, and you can verify that actually went through that email server at that time, and so it's almost non-deniable once you have the content and that hash. But that's not the default, but you get lucky with things like that in some cases. And, it was another question.
Sorry, I just have one question. And I have to apologise, I'm not tech-minded like most of the group here. But my question comes in light of Matthew Hedges, who has recently been arrested in the United Arab Emirates for doing his PhD research. And as far as I'm concerned, that most anthropologists and most social scientists who are doing field work in and around the world don't have the tech savviness that most of this group here, you guys have. So my question is that do universities have an obligation to train social scientists and anthropologists in encryption and also in dealing with this? And what would you suggest if you were running a department, how these social scientists protect their own data, protect their sources?
I would say that it should just be considered an extension of the kind of briefing you have to give to people travelling anywhere, like the local conditions. We should consider the crossing of a border to be a liability if you have data, and the range of reasons why it could be a liability is so broad, so that there should just be a standard bit of training, and it should be informed by people like CryptoParty or people that participate in crypto parties of how you avoid kind of there being a forced search of this and it revealing things that give a reason to detain you crossing borders.
And sorry to interrupt, but crypto parties, in terms of in my circle, are just they don't come up. No. So how can you make it more popular?
Yeah.
So, as a fellow social scientist and anthropologist, on the one hand, a good development is that IRBs, which are the human subjects application that you need to put into the university in order to get your project approved, more and more, if you're working on a sensitive topic, I see students all the time writing up the fact that they will encrypt their hard drive, and they've kind of been, they're a little bit like self-taught, which isn't enough, because they're not even getting their kind of human subjects applications approved without that. So that's a good move, but it's not enough precisely because you need in-house expertise. To give you a perspective of how new it is to have kind of in-house expertise that we need in NGOs, that we need in newspapers, and we need in universities, I'm pretty sure that I know the first staff technologist to be hired at an NGO. And that's Seth Schoen, who works at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And he was my roommate when I was doing fieldwork the first time around, and he was a volunteer. And he's like, I think I'm going to propose to be a staff technologist precisely to teach the lawyers about the role of technology in their cases and also provide in-house expertise. And he was hired. Since you have these types of people at the New York Times, Runa Sandvik, you have a couple of these people in Amnesty International, Claudio, Rami Rauf just got hired. I believe any journalistic outfit worth its salt must hire a tech expert, and I believe the same is required at a university as well, to provide, one-on-one training to the journalists, to the lawyers at the NGOs, and to the students at universities. And it's, I guess, up to people like myself to kind of advocate for that sort of thing. But I do think that as much as crypto parties are great, it's better to have also in-house staff technologists to do this kind of one-on-one training.
Yeah.
And we are seeing a little move in that direction in all sorts of organizations.
And I would say, so the beginning, my position was that we have to open up to different fields, so that things can only be work on a technological level. We have also to speak with other expertise, and I think it's also not only about technology, but it's also about a network of trust, because I think, for example, the example of Snowden, of course he knew how to work with technology, but the big question was who I'm going to give my data, and I think that that is also another big discussion to make, and that is why I agree with you that cannot only be solved through technology, that has to be solved with different people that have different expertise and they can communicate with each other. But also, since we are at the crypto party, I feel to say that sometimes, the things look more difficult what they are. Of course, if you want to become a super crypto expert, you need a lot of knowledge, but sometimes it's also just important that you encrypt your email for a first contact, And this was the problem with the Glenn Greenwald and Snowden. If he would have just used encryption. So I think the first step is not so difficult, but then I think cannot be just solved with that.
But yeah, I think it's just worth everyone that's aware of the importance of it pushing for a basic level of literacy in information security. It's like with hygiene, you don't need to be an expert in germs to understand that you have to do certain things to stop bad things happening because of germs, so...
Something else that is important to fight and why I love the crypto party is that there's something called security nihilism out there, which is like, the crypto is too hard. In order to secure yourself, it's too difficult, and the tools are terrible. Well, first of all, comparatively, the tools are so much better than they were 10 years ago. And there's still a lot of work to be done, but there are also, in the post-Snowden world, so many projects to improve, for example, and I know this is a big debate, but PGP and email, right? And everyone's like, Signal, PGP, don't use any encryption, you can't use any encryption. And I know a lot of the people developing these tools, and it's very, very deflating for them to kind of be told that it's impossible. And so while it's key to always relay the risks, there's always risks in using these tools. Nevertheless, it's also important to relay...
because they don't protect you 100%.
Yeah, exactly. But they're much more usable than in the past. There's a lot more options, and there's a heck of a lot of people working extremely hard to make them even more usable, and it takes time to do so. And so kind of supporting these projects, even if it's just like donating a little bit of money or supporting them on Twitter, you know, kind of goes a long way for the people on the ground who often get really bummed out when everyone claims it's all broken and it's all useless.
Yeah, I mean, I say my general advice is take on faith that you can do something concrete that's better than believing it's an insurmountable, defeatist thing that you can't do, because you can, and the more people do it, the easier it becomes, and eventually it will become something we don't even think about. It's, it's like locking your door when you leave your house. It's not that complicated conceptually than all of these other security rituals that we have. They're just be baked in for a few more centuries or a few more 100 years. So we can surmount that step.
I think this is an optimistic note to end on.
Yes.
So thanks.